Hey everyone, welcome to our second free webinar of the year for the AIARE CE Instructor Series. This one is on our most recent curriculum updates. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get rolling. All right. Okay, thank you for joining us. So this is, like I said, our second AIARE Continuing Education Series Instructor webinar of the season. And we're going to get going with talking about some curriculum updates that we've made to our AIARE 1 online learning. Before we jump into some updates, I want to give a little bit of context for this webinar. So first of all, I see a lot of familiar names on our registration list and here that have joined us for the panel now. For those that I haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Emma Walker and I am AIARE's program manager. I was originally hired as a curriculum manager and my title has changed to reflect some updates in my other duties as assigned, but I still mostly live in curriculum world. My background is in outdoor education curriculum. So I've worked as an instructor in a bunch of different capacities and as a guide, mostly a river guide, but also as a backpacking instructor. I've worked a lot of overnight camps. So I've worked with kids as little as 8, all the way up through adults. So I've spent my whole career as an outdoor educator, and then I went to Alaska Pacific University for a master's in outdoor and environmental education about 10 years ago. So curriculum is really where I like to geek out, and I'm really excited to share with you a little more about AIARE's educational philosophy and why we've chosen to make these updates. So happy to answer any questions you like about my curricular background, but that's why I really get psyched on this stuff. So I'm really pumped to show you a little more about what we've done to update our AIARE 1 online learning curriculum. So why now? I think that's a question we've gotten a few times, and I'm really excited to answer this question because it's a good question and we have a good answer for it. So first of all, to answer that question, we have to understand a little bit about the history of AIARE's online learning. So as a lot of you probably know, this was initiated as a stopgap measure when in-person classroom sessions became impossible because of the pandemic in the 2019-20 season. So what is now our online learning was thrown together really hastily in order to make it possible to continue running courses so that providers could continue to run courses when that became too dangerous because of the spread of COVID. Now, the education, like the curriculum itself, has not changed significantly. Basically, it was like pieces of the student manual were moved online, which was great, and it was better than nothing, and it was what we had to do at the time. Now it's often used as a replacement for classroom time, but it doesn't really meet that need. So often what's happening is that providers are using that as a way to replace the traditional in-person classroom sessions, but it historically has not really met the need. It hasn't been good enough to replace that. It doesn't give students the information they need, and folks are coming to courses without they're showing up for their field sessions without some of the requisite knowledge that they need that they would normally have gotten from a classroom session, and that the online learning wasn't able to get them. So we've gotten a lot of feedback from you all and from students and from providers over the last couple of years. Some of that has been formal, so I know that folks have had opportunities to provide us with that feedback, and some of it's been informal. It's been you as an instructor or a student or a provider felt like something was so great or so terrible that they wanted to let us know about it, and so they reached out on their own. And we really value all of that feedback, and we've used that to inform what we're doing in this process. So this is part of a process that we're hoping to make more formal and more continual. So until recently, we haven't necessarily always had the capacity to make regular curriculum updates, and that's what we're moving towards with this. So you'll notice, I'm sure if you get our emails, you see that this is not the only curriculum update that we've made over the course of the last 2 years, and there is more on the docket. We'll talk about that again at the end of the session, but this is part of an ongoing process in order to continually update all of our recreational curriculum. You as instructors should have just received our updated curriculum guide, and that's something that our education director, Liz Riggs-Meter, put together over the summer to really walk you through. It's essentially a tool to help you connect better to your students, and it's really closely related to the philosophy that we used to make the updates to this AIARE 1 online learning curriculum. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out, I highly recommend it. You should have gotten an email from it, and I'll make sure it's posted in the instructor Facebook group as well. It will not be your last opportunity to open that link, so you'll have more chances. So that's why we're doing this now. And then I also want to make sure folks are aware of our educational philosophy, a more formal educational philosophy. Hopefully, when you took your ITC or CLT most recently, this was covered to some extent, or at least was baked into the process of your instructor training course. But if you haven't taken one in the last couple of years, or if you've been certified longer or qualified longer than that, you may not have seen some of this specific language. So I want to get everybody on the same page about where I'm coming from as I made these updates. So everything that we've done for this curriculum update and all of our future curriculum updates are going to be based in some guiding principles for adult education. These are really similar to the principles of any education. Pedagogy is the word that refers to child education. So we're talking about andragogy, which is adult education, but there's a lot in common, and either that you use is totally fine in this context. But just to give you a sense of where we're coming from as we developed AIARE's educational philosophy and these curriculum updates, there's 4 main principles. They're really straightforward. You all as instructors are probably already aware of them, even if you're not phrasing them this way. But so the first is that adults should be involved in planning and evaluating their instruction. A lot of that in this case just means we're telling adults what we're doing, rather than we don't have to sneak their vegetables into their dinner, right? Like we can tell them what we're doing and why we're doing it, and adults appreciate that. Experience, including making mistakes, is the basis for learning activities. So folks who consider themselves experiential educators, which I think is probably most outdoor educators, you already understand this because you know that people learn by doing. This was a really radical concept when Malcolm Knowles came out with it in the 60s, but I think now it's pretty well accepted that this is how people learn best. Adults are most interested in subjects that have immediate relevance to them. Good news for you, when your students show up to courses, what you're trying to teach them has immediate relevance for them because they want to learn how to recreate in the winter backcountry, and that's why they've shown up. We're going to get into this a little bit more when I start talking about some of the specific updates and types of updates that we made, but it's really important that we make sure that adults see the immediate relevance to them in terms of some of the more technical information that we're presenting. So when we really start to get into the nitty-gritty of snowpack and weather and metamorphism and even risk management and decision making, not necessarily with the metamorphism stuff so much, but people already do a lot of risk management and decision making in their daily lives anyway. And so rather than trying to fit everything into a box where we're using a lot of really specific jargon about margins for error and decision making, what we're trying to do is bring this to students and relate it to something they already know. So immediate relevance to them. And then finally, the adult learning is problem-centered rather than content-oriented. So we're not just telling people a list of keywords. We're not just giving people a list of topics that we want to cover. What we're really doing is we're telling them the problem is you want to be able to recreate safely in the winter backcountry. And so this information fits into that in order to allowing you to do that, rather than just here is a bunch of stuff about snowpack and weather, and you should know it, but we can't fully explain why. So really focusing on how it solves the problem that they have rather than on the content itself. If you're interested in learning a bit more, what's going on with my slides? You can Google Malcolm Knowles plus andragogy. That'll get you a lot more information. Malcolm Knowles was kind of considered the father of andragogy, and on the next slide, we'll have a little bit more opportunity to learn more about him and how, or you'll have a little more opportunity to learn about those principles. We have got a QR code on the next slide. But if you're more interested, or if you're interested in learning more on Malcolm Knowles, that's around adult education, that's what you would Google. All right, so from that, we've developed kind of a 4-step process that encompasses AIARE's educational philosophy. First, naming an action as the goal. When I look at student lesson plans in ITCs, whether they're, and in fact, in a lot of CLTs, when folks first get there, because it's easy to get out of practice when you're not formally planning lessons, the first thing I often see is people have set a goal, which is awesome. So they've set their outcome, and what they want is for students to know something, which is great. And we do want students to know a lot, but it's really tough to measure that, especially in the field. So the way that we can actually measure whether we've done our job is to name an action that we can observe students doing. If we can't see them do it, we can't know that they know it. And so just knowing something doesn't cut it in this case, because we have a really short amount of time to reach our students. So this first piece of our educational philosophy is that it's key to name an action as the goal. Next, understand and connect to the student. This is a little bit of what I was talking about how adults are interested in subject matter that has immediate relevance to them. But the next job is to understand where students are. So we're naming an action as the goal. We want to understand where students are in relation to that goal. Are they pretty close? Do they already have a lot of the information they need to get them there? Is this their first time entering the winter backcountry? Have they been doing this for years and finally got peer pressured into taking an Area 1? We need to understand about who we're talking to before we can help them along the path to reach that goal. We're going to move through a skills progression. So once we understand where the student is in relation to the goal, we can actually work with different instructional techniques to get our students closer to that goal. Finally, we're going to check that the student met the goal. Can they do the thing that you asked them to do? I'm going to throw up this QR code. Liz Riggs-Meter and I did, we had a poster and a paper at the most recent International Snow Science Workshop in Bend, where we talked a little more about AIARE's educational philosophy and how we've incorporated it into our recreational curriculum and into our instructor training curriculum. We like to get really meta with it. So we've got a poster, and then as part of that poster, we developed a little 1-page handout that summarizes this philosophy in a little more detail than you can see here on this slide, and then we had time to cover this evening. We also gave a workshop at the Wilderness Risk Management Conference last year. And then if anyone's attended our instructional workshop that we offered in person last year, and then I think this year's unfortunately ended up being canceled, but that was a full-day workshop that really worked on lesson planning from this perspective. And we'll be doing more with this and continuing to incorporate it into our ITCs, CLTs, and other CE offerings. So I'm just going to leave this up for another second in case anybody wants to just grab it on their phone so you can check it out more later. So let's move on to some of the actual updates that we made. So to understand why we made the updates we did, I need you to understand the purpose of AIARE online learning. I see this as having kind of 3 primary purposes. So I'll tell you what they are. First of all, we want to give rec students a chance to prepare for their field sessions at a pace that works for them and their cognition and their schedule. So I'm avoiding the term learning styles here. If you've ever done a workshop with me, you've probably already heard me talk about why the phrase learning styles doesn't necessarily work for me, and I can get into that more later if folks want. But really, really my beef is that lots of different people have lots of different learning styles. And so trying to say, I'm a kinesthetic learner, I really need to touch things or do things doesn't necessarily sum it up for everybody. But if everybody gets an opportunity to do a bunch of different things, it's much more likely that everybody will understand that something will hit for somebody. So we want to give students a chance to prepare for their field sessions. If you really work hard to keep that beginner's mindset, you can probably look back to the first time you got on skis or a split board or a sled or snowshoes or whatever it is that you're teaching on. You can probably look back on that and remember that it was a little bit scary and you weren't really sure what to expect. And so we're really trying to give students a chance to prepare. Also, we know that adult learners have different schedules and needs than kid learners, right? So we're mostly dealing with students who are signing up for a course and then they're needing to do their coursework after work or on weekends, between, on breaks from their job, between dropping kids off and picking them up, and all kinds of other adult things that folks have to do. So we really want to give them a chance to do this asynchronously at their own pace. It also, this wasn't its original intention. The original intention was to replace all of the classroom learning because that's what we had. You deal with the cards you get dealt, and so that's what we did in 2020. But originally it did replace that, but that was never intended to be its long-term purpose. Now we would like this to be able to replace some, but not necessarily all of the traditional classroom portions of a course. It's just not enough to replace all of those in-person sessions. Students do, depending on the student, you'll get some folks, and this is true in every demographic and in every class, you'll get some folks who are really on top of it and who really go through and are super diligent about their studies. And you're going to get some folks who are just going to kind of click through and do the bare minimum in order to be able to access the course. And that's okay. For those folks, showing up and being able to attend a Zoom office hours or lecture session, or the classroom portions of a course or the field portion of a course, is when they're going to get the information they need. So this is meant to replace some of that. And I'm going to talk at the end of the session about some of the recommended pathways, like what I think could be a good way to run a course based on this online learning. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But and then finally, we want folks to remain accessible, or want this to remain accessible as a reference for students after their courses. I know we tell providers this, but I don't know how good we've been about telling instructors. Students have access to this for up to a year after their courses. So they can go back after they finish their field days with you all, and they can go back and refer to pieces of this. And they can even, depending when in the year they took their course, they may even be able to go back before they head out the following season and do a little refresh. So that's the intention, is that this is something that folks can still access afterwards, and that's still going to be useful to them. So what did we do to the online learning? This kind of falls into 3 buckets. So the first is content. We overhauled not the content, not the meat, the subject matter that's in there, but the way that it's worded. So I was really careful to go through and translate as much of what's in there from some pretty jargon heavy phrasing into plain English as possible. That meant removing acronyms or defining acronyms as much as possible, using terms that we're actually defining terms within the text and reminding people what they are, for things like, what I would call a vocab word, if you're thinking in traditional, if you go back to your middle and high school education, vocabulary words that are going to be important that you might find in a glossary in a textbook. Really try to highlight and bold those, or put them in their own separate text box to define them, so that folks could really understand what we were talking about, and tied content directly to the field book whenever possible. So that included putting a lot of screenshots and snippets from the field book, actually telling folks this is what page you can find this on in the field book, and making sure that a lot of those checks for understanding referenced those field book pieces, so it's not unfamiliar to students when they show up to their courses. So really trying to keep things as plain English as possible. We don't need recreational students to understand every specific snow science term. We need them to understand how to make good decisions when they're in a group in the backcountry. So that was the focus in the content sense. For tone, a lot of what was previously there, as if you've read through it before, I've gotten this feedback from a number of students, and I definitely see it as I go through. It felt a bit unapproachable. It's this really straightforward, really scientific. And so we tried to really make the tone conversational, yet still authoritative, but really accessible. We tried to tie stuff to real life and relatable scenarios as much as possible. And that included a lot of the checks for understanding. We used a lot of scenarios rather than just those reading comprehension questions.
And then we have a much better photo library than we did when this was created. So I was able to add a lot more photos and illustrations to break up those walls of text, because as I'm sure you know, if you went through the online learning in the last couple of years, there's a lot of text. There's still a lot of text, and we're working on that. But for now, we've broken it up a bit and hopefully given people a little bit more to start with. And then finally, our checks for understanding. As an educator, it always drives me crazy when I go in and see that a quiz or a check for understanding is actually just a bunch of reading comprehension. I have always been a really nervous test taker. And so I happen to be the sort of person that if I'm going through, if I am going through a piece of online learning, and then I get like, I've gone on to the quiz and there's the quiz in front of me and I don't have any like notes or references. And it's just like, okay, remember what you just read. Now tell us. That totally throws me and I have a really hard time, and I know I'm far from alone in that. So really trying to remove just reading comprehension, because anybody can open a new tab on with the content there and just kind of like pass the quiz by rote or by copying and pasting or whatever, and really make it some application so that we're asking students to actually think about the content that they're learning. And then hopefully the understanding, my understanding is that they'll come away from it with a better understanding. It's not necessarily about getting the right answer so much as it is we're asking students to start giving this some thought. Just so folks know, I can see that we've got a couple questions popping into the Q&A. Since it's just me, I'm going to keep rolling through this, but I'll answer everyone's questions at the end. I'll start with what's in the Q&A, and then I'll also give people an opportunity to you should be able to raise your hand, and then I can call on you so you can unmute and ask me your question verbally. But feel free to keep dropping those questions into the Q&A, and I'll get to them as soon as I'm done. But if I stop now, I'm going to lose my place, and then nobody wants that. So, okay, moving on. A couple examples. So this is a screenshot from the plan section on anticipating the hazard. And I just want to draw your attention to this second paragraph. This is an example of what we're trying to do. So we're trying to relate to students and what they normally do anyway. Even if you have never ventured into the winter backcountry, even if you are the student who's going to be cutting your skins in the parking lot on the first day of your course, you care about the weather. It affects you. It affects what you're wearing, as we noted here, whether you're, how you're going to commute to work, what you're going to do on your lunch break, that kind of thing. So folks care about the weather. They already check the weather every day. It's probably not using all of the same tools that we as avalanche professionals use, but they already have a framework for checking the weather. And so we want to lean into that, because really all we're asking them to do is adjust that framework a little bit for a slightly different setting. But we don't need to treat them like they have never heard of checking the weather before, right? Because folks know how to do that. This is part of understanding and connecting to the student. Then for how weather affects the avalanche hazard, what I've done is I've tried to, again, make this something that isn't necessarily a correct answer, but we're asking students to tell us what they're already doing to get them thinking about this. So here, I'm asking folks to just let us know how often they check the weather and how they check the weather. Probably, like I said, there are some students who are going to write 6 sentences about the various ways that they check the weather and why. And there's some folks who are going to write blah, 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 and go on to the next thing. And I know that, and that's okay with me, because I think the real thing that matters is that students are thinking about how they typically check the weather. And that's something that they're going to come to your course having already given some thought. So when you show them the resources to check the weather and the avalanche forecast and what all of those links mean, they're already going to have like a little pin in their brain that has started this for them. And this is part of that checking that the student has met the goal. That job isn't done when they finish this quiz. You have to do a little bit more of that. So we're going to do a quick demo. Hopefully this, great. That was so much smoother than I feared it would be. All right, I'm going to give this just a second to load. Might already have it up here. Okay, great. So when your students log in, this is exactly the same as it was before. At least one provider has asked me this season whether the codes that students will get will be the same for their provider as last year. None of that has changed. So provider codes haven't changed. Your students are going to get access to the online learning the same way they always have. This is that first screen that they're going to see, except it's not going to say 100% complete yet. They're going to have to do it first. So what we've done is told people a little bit here about why they're here and what this is for. And then there are some opportunities to download this year's recreational student materials. So I've linked a sample field book here that students can download. There is an AIARE 1 student manual and a motorized version of that. And then you can see that the course content looks a lot the same as it did throughout the whole process. A lot of this should look familiar to you, so you can expand a topic and see what the different lessons and checks for understanding are. The one little thing is that I've made a couple of changes to the flow. And really it's just things that I did this. We'll see how this goes. So I'll be interested in your feedback on it. I moved a couple things around that I felt like made more sense in different places. So teamwork used to come at the very end. And that just didn't work for my brain. And I had a sense that it may not work for others either. So I bumped teamwork up to be right after assemble your group. So instead of telling people, here's how to assemble a group and what to look for in a good backcountry group and how to accommodate your fellow backcountry travelers and how to have some of these conversations. And then we learn all this other stuff. And then we're like, hey, remember the people that you're going to go out with? Instead, what I've done is I've moved teamwork up to have that conversation right after you think about having about how to assemble your group. Things like that. There's a few little things that I've moved around. I also prepare was a little bit scattered previously. There was a couple places where some of the like investigate trip options was happening closer to the plan section. And basically what I've done instead is moved everything so that the plan, ride, and debrief that are happening as part of your daily routine all happen together. And then the seasonal routine happens at the end. And so students actually have some context for what that prepare means before we're asking them to think about those seasonal routines. If you've already looked at that curriculum guide that Liz created, you might have noticed that she mentions that it's often easier to talk about the daily routines before the seasonal routine. And so really, I'm just trying to kind of match things here so that we're consistent in all of our materials. How you choose to teach it is up to you. We'll talk more about it in a few minutes, but this is the order that I've put things in for students. So I've pulled up a couple of the checks for understanding that I wanted to walk you through. And then at the end, I'm going to leave this up. So if folks have questions about specific content, I'm happy to come back over to this at the end. Whew. Okay, so thinking about assembling your group, a thing that has always bugged me about reading comprehension questions is we really treat them like a quiz. And yes, we want students to be able to answer these questions. We also know that it's okay if they don't immediately know all of the answers after reading through something one time. So what I've done is I've taken what's in the field book and I've pasted it into the prompt for this question. So basically what I'm doing here, and sorry if this is tough to read as I'm screen sharing if you're seeing this on a smaller screen, but basically what I've done is the questions that we ask folks to think about as they're looking at the assemble their group pages in the field book. So if we're asking folks to look at, right here, this is not the page with the prompts, it's just a blank trip planning page. But here in this assemble your group, I've taken the questions that we have on those planning pages and I put them here. So compatible goals, risk tolerance, group consensus, group size, honest open communication. Those are things that we just went over previously in the assemble your group lesson. So here's the assemble your group lesson. We've gone over what each of those things means. I've put some things in blue boxes to ask students to go through those questions. We've defined what group consensus is. So really trying to break things down Again, I know it's a lot of text, and that is something that I want to work on. Then when folks go to the practice section, they don't have to open a new tab. They don't have to feel like they're cheating because they don't remember all these answers, but they can, basically, we're asking people to think about their ideal backcountry group. So for folks who already have a partner, a group that they tour with, we're asking them to just think about those people. Otherwise, this might feel a little silly, but again, it's more about getting students to think about the answers to these questions than it is about actually making sure they know anything at this point. So if you've never been in the backcountry and you're here at your Area 1 course for the first time, hoping to make some friends that you can tour with, you can keep it hypothetical. So you can use friends or historical figures or a Kardashian or whatever to think about the answers to those questions. Then I'm just asking people to essentially go through the questions, and sorry, I have to type responses in order to show you the questions. We're asking people to just think about who's in their group and what group dynamics they think those are going to create. So anticipating who will be the most vocal member of their group, who might have a hard time voicing their opinion. We're asking people to think about the answers to these questions with actual people and scenarios in mind. Once I've gone through the people, I'm asking people to think about a scenario. I hate when people read things off like this, but I'm going to read it because I think it's probably really hard to read if you're just looking at this on a small screen. This question is, imagine you made plans for a long day in the backcountry with this group that you just defined. The morning of the tour, you wake up and you just feel off. Maybe you feel like you're getting that cold you've been trying to fight off, or an interaction at work is really bugging you and leaving you feeling distracted. You check the avalanche forecast first thing, and conditions are really different than what you expected. In any case, you're just not feeling up for it for the day that you and your group had planned. How would you approach this conversation with the group you've assembled? Are you comfortable broaching this topic with them? Explain in a couple sentences. I'm not asking people to write an essay. It's totally fine if they use bullet points. And you can feel free to tell them that in your introductory email. But really just asking people to think, this is a real life scenario. I know it's happened to, I hope it's happened to all of you. I hope you've woken up and thought, this isn't what I expected. We got to recalibrate what we're going to do today. And it's something that as avalanche professionals, we know it can be really tough to do. And we're asking students to do that. So we're asking them to think about what that looks like. That's the final quiz. As you can see, even if you just type in a bunch of random letters, you will receive 4 out of 4 points, or 100%, and be able to move on to the next section. So that's kind of the format, not for all of the checks for understanding, but for a lot of them, we've really moved into that. Same thing for the teamwork section, we're essentially we're scaffolding like one step further. So now that we've had people think about what that teamwork contract looks like, and the things that they're agreeing to as part of a team, and just as a refresher, because I imagine it's been a while since anybody has looked through the Area 1 online learning. We just went through, by the time folks get to this section, they'll have just gone through this teamwork section. Basically, and you'll recognize this from the framework and from the field book, but we're defining what travel and decide together, listen to every voice, challenge assumptions, and respect any veto look like. We're going into a fair amount of detail about each of those things, and defining it as a process. And so by the time students get to this check for understanding, my hope is that they're able and willing to think through what that looks like in a handful of different scenarios. So again, I'm not going to go through and like read off every scenario because you all can access this at your own pace, and I would encourage you to do that before you're asking students to. But basically, it's things like the common denominator of pretty much all of these scenarios is things are happening. They're not what you expected. How do you talk to your group about it? Which is really kind of what it boils down to. You can see some of these are a little more involved than others, but a lot of really what we're asking is, what's the best way to proceed? What should you say to your group? How would you personally react? And I'm hoping to ask people, we talk about a lot. I often hear these phrases, hard skills and soft skills. And our soft skills are supposed to be our socio-emotional skills and our ability to interact with other people. But I feel really strongly, and I know I'm not alone in this. Sorry, it's a webinar, so I can't see anyone's faces. So I just get to get right up on my soapbox. I feel really strongly that socio-emotional skills are a hard skill. One, they're not an easy skill to learn or to maintain. And two, it can be, it's something that people need to continue to develop and define and hone over the course of an entire lifetime. It can't just be one person's job to have the soft skills for the group. Everyone needs to have those socio-emotional skills. And essentially what we're asking you as area instructors to do is help people develop those skills in 3 days, which is too much to ask. So what we're trying to do is get folks started thinking about that and remembering that that's going to be an important skill just as much as being able to check the forecast, just as much as being able to identify avalanche terrain, just as much certainly as getting into a pit and being able to define different types of snow grains. It's really important that people know whether it would be tough for them to speak up or whether it would come easily to them, and actually really being honest with themselves about their reactions. So trying to do a little bit of really getting people to think about their own socio-emotional intelligence in online learning, which is more challenging than it sounds. Okay, couple more, and then I'm going to wrap it up and give you all a chance to ask questions. Another thing, so there are a few scenarios where it doesn't make sense to ask people open-ended essay questions. And we really do need to check for understanding by making sure that they can answer some questions correctly. What I've done when that's the case is I've given people the resource that they need in order to answer the question. So rather than be like, okay, you had your 30 seconds to skim through this previous lesson, memorize everything, and then be able to answer this quiz, I'm just putting the North American Public Danger Scale here and telling people to refer to it as they answer these questions. This is the kind of thing that, we've got lots of like some really straightforward questions and answers. Low avalanche danger means no avalanche danger. People can use context clues and probably know that that's going to be false, right? Even if they just skimmed the previous section. So in all of these quizzes, one thing I have not changed about this is that in all of these quizzes, people can retake them as many times. They do need to get 100% to move on, but people can take or retake them as many times as they need to in order to get to 100. They can, if they're feeling annoyed or frustrated, they can continue and then come back later. All of this is really easy to access at any point in the course with this sidebar. So people can, if they need another chance, they can make that happen. And then a couple more. Again, this is just an example of where I've put things from the field book and from the framework into the content itself. So in this case, what we've done is there's a couple different scenarios. I'll just read this one off really quickly. Say the slope you see in this photo is 35 degrees. This guy, your group needs to get across it and across and down it in order to get back to the trailhead. The slope angle, as folks will know by the time they get to this point in the online learning, means it's prime avalanche terrain. So you've decided to travel one at a time. Which of these spots is probably the best place for everyone to regroup? Folks are probably not going to have a really hard time with a question like this, and that's okay. We don't need to throw them all the curveballs. We need to make sure they generally understand what we just talked about. So we've got a couple scenarios here, a couple, that we've given another scenario. Which of these routes makes the most sense to you, given the conditions that are in the scenario? And then another that's, again, testing some more of those socio-emotional skills. So here's a nice photo of people. There's some people standing at the top of the hill. Your group has just finished touring uphill and is planning to ride the slope right in front of these folks. And for the purpose of the scenario, we're saying it's between 30 and 35 degrees. You arrive and find that the group pictured is discussing the conditions in their plan. Are you going to head over and chat with them? What are you going to ask them? Are you going to wait for them to just clear out so you're not right on top of each other? I've defined a couple options, and then we say either of these options is fine, depending on what you and your group are most comfortable with. But I want to know I want students to tell us how they would proceed. And based on what you learned in the last lesson, what other considerations you might take as you're getting ready to ride an avalanche terrain. So again, this is one of those that people can just, actually, I don't think I've answered all the questions. So I'm going to not move on from this one. But so that's another example of where we're using scenarios and a combination of a little bit of reading comprehension and a little bit of more involved extrapolation and application, plus something from the field book. And then the last example that I wanted to give folks is, I think probably the most challenging section to address in an online learning format is rescue. You all get that, right? I mean, the best way to practice rescue is to practice rescue. And so just talking about it doesn't necessarily do students a whole lot of good, but they need to have some basic information by the time they show up in order to make the most of their time on their Area 1 course, because we do a fair amount. Now that we have the rescue course, there's less time spent practicing rescue. So we really want folks to come with some of that. So for this, I've told students, you're going to get this in your field book. You're going to get this quick reference card, and this is available and pictured on here we can actually, you can see this is what the how to practice rescue looks like. Here's the classic video I'm sure you've all seen of Margaret Wheeler talking about how to do your practice setup. We also have the rescue practice checklist that folks can download here, that we ask them to take with them whenever they go into the field to practice. So we've got some downloadable resources available here for students, but we're asking them to read about like the various things that they need to be able to do. And then they can use the Avalanche Rescue Quick Reference, which they could download either on the previous page or right here in the blue box, to put these steps in order. My hope is that people will try to do it on their own before they go through and just like look and move things around based on what they're seeing. But even if they don't, that's okay, because again, what we're asking them to do is simply go through and start thinking about this. We don't need them to know everything or have all the answers. We need them to be thinking about this. So that's my super quick demo. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions. Give me just 1 second to go back through our slides, and then to just finish with these last couple things, and then I'll answer some questions. So if your students have gone through all of the online learning, what can you expect them to show up to their courses being able to do? Well, it depends what you have them do. Of course, that's the caveat. A lot of times we see that instructors or providers assign a few sections to a student or to students. And sometimes we see that people ask students to go through the whole thing. This iteration of the online learning is more conducive to completing standalone sections. So we've really tried to make it so that while you certainly can have folks go through the whole thing, it's also possible to just assign maybe the prepare section or the plan, write, and debrief sections. It's more conducive to standing alone sections for things that are just tough to cover in the field and or without significant classroom time. So some of that really technical information, weather and snowpack stuff is one that comes to mind as a place that you might want to have students have a little extra practice before they get to you. So things like that. Really the things that I personally think make a lot of sense to define, and this goes back to my soapbox earlier, assigning those teamwork and group dynamic sections so you can incorporate them throughout and maybe even seemingly unrelated lessons. If folks already have like a little kernel of that in their brain, it's going to be a lot easier for them to understand what you're talking about when you're teaching what seems like an unrelated lesson, but still incorporating some group dynamic. There we go. Okay, so a couple possible pathways, and then I'm going to get to your questions. I see they're adding up in there. A couple possible pathways. You could assign just the plan and prepare sections of the online learning. And again, these are all things that you could do that would be fine as far as AIARE is concerned. And in no way do you have to do them. I will emphasize that again in a minute. You could assign just a few sections of the online learning. Then you could do like a 1-hour Zoom session that's essentially office hours. It's optional for students. You and a co-instructor could show up and be prepared to answer some questions about logistics and about the sections of the online learning they went through. Or also students can always go through, even if you only assign certain sections, they can go through the whole thing and may have questions about that. Do a quick 1-hour Zoom where people can ask you their questions. And then you could still go with some traditional classroom sessions throughout the course. You could meet in the classroom each morning and do an hour each morning. If you don't have a classroom space, that obviously makes a difference in what you're going to be doing for your course. So just thinking about the different ways to arrange this. You could also assign all of the online learning and have a 2-hour Zoom session. The key is it really needs to be interactive. So I've had a couple instructors email me and be like, okay, can I just like give a presentation and people can watch it later if they can't show up? Sure, you can do that. I think students are going to get a lot more out of it if they're being asked to interact with you and you're putting people in breakout groups and asking some real questions that ask them to think about what they're learning. That's my strong recommendation. Even if you assign all of the online learning and you're not going to do any traditional classroom sessions, I think in particular in that case, it's important to have a synchronous Zoom session. And that would just mean I can never bring myself to say no classroom sessions because the field is our classroom, right? But that would mean they are answering questions on the course and on an ad hoc basis as people are asking them to you, not necessarily having dedicated classroom sessions for that content. Finally, you could skip the online learning altogether. This is in no way required. I think it's a useful tool. I think it's a more useful tool now than it was a few months ago. But you could skip it altogether and just have students show up like the traditional 3-day course where you spend a lot of one day in a classroom and then you spend a lot of the other 2 days in the field. And you're not doing anything online. You're not doing a hybrid format at all. And that's totally okay. In that case, I would still recommend having that 1-hour Zoom office hour session, or at least in your initial course email to students, giving them an opportunity to ask any logistical questions. And in that case, my ask to you would be, if you're going to skip the online learning and you're maybe going to do a Zoom, but maybe just telling people when and where to show up, I'm always happy to review pre-course emails and help you hone them so that they're really answering all the questions that students have, even the ones they might be too embarrassed to ask, so that they are showing up set up for success on their first day. And then you would just have your traditional classroom sessions, either all in one day or part of each day. And that would also be fine. So you don't have to do it this way or any of these ways. You all are out there teaching a lot more than I am. I mostly sit at a desk these days. So you don't have to do it this way. These are just a couple of possible pathways to give you a sense of what I think the online learning is capable of now. Okay, with all of that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute and I'm going to start looking through your Q&A and I'm going to do my best to read your questions and keep up with you as I go. Okay, first question is from Lauren. Is the assumption for the online content that students already have their field book? No, it's not. I assume that most students will not have a field book already by the time they have this. And they don't need to. So in the online learning, what I've tried to do is they do have the sample field book. There's a PDF. And students can download it. And that's noted in the sections where we are asking students to answer field book related questions. But even if they don't, every time I reference the field book, there's a screenshot of the specific section I'm referencing and usually a page number. Obviously, those page numbers correspond to the most recent version of the field book. So if your provider is still giving out field books from a season or two ago, your student might have to flip their page 1 or 2 times. But nope, students don't need a field book in order to complete the online learning. Okay, so that one's answered. Okay, someone asks, does the online learning content replace the student manual? That's a good question. I think, our AIARE's policy is that providers are not required to provide students with a hard copy of the student manual, although we do need them to furnish a copy if the student asks for it. Students can download a copy of the student manual. It's linked here in the area one, which we've gone over tonight, but also in the rescue and area two. Those changes are still being finalized. So we'll get to more of that later in the season. But I wouldn't say it replaces things, because I think it's a nice reference to have. If you're referencing parts of that, I mean, a lot of students like to be able to hear what you're saying and look at their notes and also see it written down somewhere and have something to highlight. So I wouldn't say it replaces it, but I would say it's, it covers the same content. And so I think that the way that the online learning is now written is more accessible than the student manual. And I hope to make some pretty significant changes to that manual in the next 2 seasons. I'd like to do a lot more translating the manual into plain English and removing some of the jargon and better defining terms kind of thing. But I would say that while it isn't necessarily a replacement, it does cover the same content. And so you're fine to just stick with one or the other. Okay, Jill, great question. For checks for understanding and scenarios, how does the student get feedback on their answers? Does the course provider need to give feedback? Does AIARE do it? Does the course leader see the students enter and give feedback? That's a great question. So for those checks for understanding, where students are just kind of putting in they're like typing a couple sentences to answer the scenario. I think one way that I can potentially head that off is to, we can just give folks a note at the beginning of their course that is in, maybe even in this first screen that students see, that says you won't necessarily receive individualized feedback. It's more just to get you thinking about things. But Jill, thank you. That's a great question. All right, next person. The pictures with comprehension questions are great. The ones with colored lines won't work for folks who are colorblind. Just something to think about. And this person mentions that one of their instructors can't tell between green and reds. They wouldn't be able to do that one. That's a really good point. This is why I would love it if we had somebody who was able to help me go through from an accessibility standpoint on all of these questions. Thank you to whoever submitted this question. I really appreciate that. And that's definitely something to take into consideration. I'm going to be making some more updates to this based on kind of the initial round of feedback that I get after this webinar. And that's something that would be awesome. If you're comfortable, the anonymous person who submitted this, if you're comfortable shooting me an email, if you have any resources that might be helpful, or if anyone has resources that might be helpful in thinking about some other options for folks who can't see color, I would really appreciate that. It'd be really helpful to me in my kind of one-person curriculum capacity right now. But thank you for bringing that to my attention. I really appreciate it. That's really important, and we want to make sure everyone's included. Next, is AIARE's recommendation for digging still to go down slope 1.5 times, or are there updates about digging closer to the probe given recent research? That is a great question. I'm not going to get too far into it because I don't want to get too far into content tonight. I want to mostly just focus on the updates to the curriculum itself, rather than on the updates to the content. But what I can tell you is that there was, I think, I'm guessing where some of this question is coming from, or that folks might be having a similar question, is there was a presentation at the International Snow Science Workshop in Bend last month, where someone, an Italian researcher, had done a bunch of research with 3-person groups and found that it was faster to get to an airway to dig straight down or closer to the probe rather than stepping away 1.5 times the distance. If you have this question, I would encourage you to show up to our webinar on Thursday, when we're going to have all the major beacon manufacturers there, and ask them what they think about that question. I was left scratching my head at the end of that presentation, in part because all of those groups were just 3 people, so they didn't necessarily have the capacity to do a conveyor belt. And also, all of the studies were done on a flat ground instead of on a slope, and that obviously affects where the snow goes. So I don't have a great answer for you. We have not changed any of our recommendations for this year's curriculum, but I hope someone will ask that question on Thursday, because I'd really like to hear what all the Beacon folks have to say about it. Next, Daryl, where are students told to read the student manual first and then do the online learning? That's a good question. I don't know that necessarily students are always told that. Sometimes I think providers ask them to do it. Sometimes I think providers don't ask them to do it. Sometimes providers don't use the student manual at all, and I think that's okay. I think whatever combination of educational tools you choose to use is fine. And I'm going to actually just grab this next person's question too. It's another anonymous one. Should we be asking students to fully read the student manual? We often hear it's repetitive with online content. I've heard that a lot as well. I think it's okay if you're not asking students to read the student manual. I think the student manual is really more widely used when most providers were only doing classroom sessions and not including online content, or not when there was no online learning. So it was, hi, here's the student manual, show up, you can read it beforehand, and then this is what we're going to be using as our guideline. And that's just not the case anymore, because most providers are using the online learning. So I think it's okay if you tell students this exists as a resource to supplement the online learning, but it's not necessary that you ask them to read through it cover to cover. Sometimes it has more detail than what is found in the online learning. In fact, I would say often it has more detail. But it's not necessarily, like I said, one isn't meant to necessarily replace the other. There's a lot of the same information, and it's okay if you're using both, and it's okay if you're not using both. Right. Next, Daryl, did you consider using the questions in the student manual in the online learning? That's a good question. I did. Some of the questions in the student manual are great. The issue with updating the student manual is when we update that manual, we have to make a lot of updates in a lot of different places. And so that also means that we have to update that so that there's a new version of the manual that providers can download from or order copies of from Mimeo, which is the provider we use it's the vendor we use so that providers can order, like you can, if you order a couple hundred copies of a student manual, if that's what you're doing. Basically, I'm considering some of the questions in this year's online learning sort of a test case. If we can think of it as we're piloting some of these new questions, some of these new ways of approaching the pedagogy. I think I'd like to hear some feedback about how these questions are working for students and how well you as instructors think they're working for students. And then I will make some updates both to the student manual and to these questions based on that feedback. So there is a little bit of overlap, but it's a lot of brand new questions. And I'm interested to see how those are received. Thanks, Daryl, for that question. All right, another anonymous question. Can we upload a list of students to see student progress, or do we still have to enter emails one by one as in past years, which, yes, is totally slow and time consuming? That's a really good question that I don't have an answer to right now, but I am just going to copy it into my list of questions to ask Sarah, our member services manager, and Sarah will have some answers for us. She always has the answers. So Sarah will be able to tell us what the plan is for checking, to streamline checking student progress. So thank you for asking that. I've got it down and I will ask it to Sarah, and I'll include it in my follow-up email that will go out early next week. Let's see. Oh, great recommendation for the colorblind stuff, using some shapes and letters instead of colors. These are the things that you don't think of when you're talking live in front of 40 people, but that hopefully I would have eventually come to on my own. Thank you, Lauren, for that suggestion. I really appreciate it. Next, and another anonymous one. You're using the word beacon. Many AIARE instructors I've had have been adamant that you should be using the word transceiver. What does AIARE suggest we use? Another great question. I have some mixed feelings on this. I think that the most important thing is that we, as instructors, make material as accessible to students as possible. The reason that I continue to use the words beacon and transceiver interchangeably is that a lot of what folks are seeing out there in the world that AIARE has no control over is the word beacon is still being used. It's still being used in like trailhead checks, beacon, probe, shovel, whether that's, it's not necessarily what's being said in AIARE videos. We're using transceiver for the most part in our official communications. But we're also hearing that folks are still saying the word beacon. We're also seeing that like in awareness talks, in gear shop talks, at trailheads among groups, the word beacon is still being used. So my strong feeling is that for recreational courses, what actually matters is that students know how to use their device and know that the words beacon and transceiver both refer to the same device. I understand that there is some potential confusion with an avalanche beacon or transceiver versus a personal locator beacon. Totally understand that. My feeling is that it is okay to use whichever word comes into your brain when you're speaking to your students, to recreational students. It's a little bit different, I know, with professional students who are going to be working as avalanche professionals, but we don't need recreationalists to be mini professionals. We need them to make good decisions in the backcountry. And so my feeling is that it's important to meet them where they're at. Many of them know the word beacon, and I think it's more important that they understand its use. So your specific part of your question, what does AIARE suggest we use? Go ahead and use transceiver, and I certainly will make those updates if we get to a point where the recommendation, like from that EMI working group, is let's only ever say transceiver and no one say beacon ever again. I will totally update our curriculum based on that. In the AIARE online learning for the AIARE 1, I actually in a couple of different places have noted for students, I mostly use the word transceiver in the curriculum, but I have noted for students, these two words refer to the same device. So essentially, you're not silly, whichever of them you're using. And if you hear someone talk about one, that's what they're talking about. Thanks for that question. That's great. And then let's see, Jody, is there a teen AIARE curriculum in the works? Great question. We have been working this summer on an awareness curriculum, and there is a pretty significant youth portion of that. Mostly the Colorado Avalanche Information Center primarily tries to reach a lot of high school age kiddos. And so that's sort of an awareness level. I don't know that we have any specific plans to develop an AIARE 1 or rescue curriculum that's specifically oriented to teens. I will say for now that we've kind of translated a lot of this into plain English, my hope is that it would be more accessible to teenage kids. But I think that's a great question, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in chatting more about that, my inbox is always open. So I'm always interested in hearing suggestions from instructors, and I would love to hear more about what that could look like and who the audience for that, where we might find instructors who'd be interested in teaching that sort of thing. So thanks, Jody. That's a great question. Okay, I've gone through all the questions in the Q&A. Would anyone like to raise your hand? Oh, wait, here's one more. Let's see, from Lauren, are there any plans to move to a different learning management system in the future with more interactive capabilities? That's one of those above my pay grade questions. We are committed to using this content management system for at least one more season. I know just based on our contract with them. I, as you can probably imagine, have some frustrations with this one as well. It's not my favorite learning management system, but it's what we've got for now. I certainly will mention that someone asked this to the powers that be as we're thinking about making some updates. But for now, we are going to be on LearnDash, which is what the LMS that we're using now is. Thanks for that question, Lauren. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, thanks for sharing all the information. I really appreciate it. Many of those anonymous questions were me, but I was just embarrassed to be asking so many questions.
Don't be.
I don't know how many people are on the call. That the piece about uploading users, I think is a pretty major pain point for us. And I would say any larger provider, if my guess is that larger providers are not checking on the status of whether students are completing things because it's so painful. So, we have, I don't know, maybe we're not a large provider, but, hundreds of students, and we have to manually go through one by one and search for the student. And then if they haven't signed up yet, we have to do it again later once they've signed up. So it's not like we do it once. It's like over the course of 2 weeks or 3 weeks, like every day somebody has to be going in and like, oh, have this list of students gotten smaller, and you keep searching until you add them in. It's pretty painful. So it's a, I would say, a major limit. I mean, it's set up for a small group, not a large group.
Yeah.
6 students.
That sounds maddening.
It's terrible.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry for that experience. And I just jotted down some notes as you were talking. So I have a check-in with Sarah, our wonderful member services manager, later this week. I know for folks who also work on the provider side, I know you've probably also received emails about like, Sarah has offered, if you want to send her a spreadsheet, she'll do a bulk course upload for you. So she is super willing and able to create workarounds to make providers and instructors' lives easier. So
Great.
I don't know that I will have an immediate solution, but I will mention it to her, and she is just dogged about finding ways to make people's lives easier. So she is super awesome. And once I put it in her hands, she will help us figure out something. So I don't know what that will be, but Sarah will help me figure it out. So thank you for that feedback. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for the suggestion.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Okay, let's see. I have one more. Oh, here's a great question from someone who's asking where we can find Liz's curriculum guide that I mentioned. Let me actually just, I think I can drop something into the chat. And otherwise I will include it in my follow-up email. I'll include it as an attachment. So that is, that's the curriculum guide that I referenced. We sent it out in an instructor email that went out a day or two ago. I think that went out maybe yesterday on Monday, and I'll post it in the provider group, and I'll include it in my follow-up to this as well. Okay, so last thing, couple things. We just talked about questions, but next up, kind of our next steps are, I'm going to continue to be making some changes to the Area 1 online learning. It won't be anything that will affect your students' ability to complete their courses, but just as we get feedback from folks, this question really isn't working the way it's written, or things like the making those updates to be accommodating of folks who are colorblind, that sort of thing. I'll be making some of those questions or updates throughout the season. The Area 2 online learning is still to you all. I have like a sandbox is what the coders call it, like essentially a working version of it, where I'm making updates to that and the rescue, and those just are not quite ready yet. The Area 1, since that's our most taken course for rec students, was my top priority to complete in time for the season to begin. Most Area 2 courses are offered later enough in the season that I think I'll be able to have those ready in time. And the rescue stuff, a lot of providers don't use the online learning for rescue, but once we've made some initial updates to the rescue portion of the Area 1 online learning, I'll transfer those over. So those are in the rescue. Those are kind of our immediate next steps. Longer term, got a lot of questions about the student manual tonight, and the plan is to make some updates to the student manual. I don't have a great sense yet of exactly what that will look like, so I'm not going to say anything now because I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. But of course, we'll keep folks updated on that as we go. And your input is super valuable, so we want to make sure that we're capturing what you're thinking of these updates as we're making continued updates, because we can't make functional updates without input from instructors, because you all are the ones who are using this. And it's really important to me to make sure that you're getting what you need and your students are getting what they need. Those are kind of the immediate next steps when it comes to what's happening with curriculum. Next up, a little bit more housekeeping. We have a couple more webinars coming up this week. For folks who attended the comparing mapping apps webinar last week, I felt like that format worked really well. We had a representative from each of our major partners show up and talk to us, answer some of the same questions about each of their apps, so that we could create a cheat sheet type resource. And we're going to do that with the beacons again. We've gotten this feedback a lot that people are like, if someone shows up with, say, an ARVA beacon that I've never seen before, and I have to troubleshoot on a rescue or an Area 1 course, I don't really know what to do because I've never encountered this beacon before. So we're going to have panelists from each of the major manufacturers come out and talk to us about their most popular, or in some cases, their newest products, so that you can, we can create sort of a cheat sheet type resource just to give you a quick sense. This is the in progress cheat sheet. I have a few more updates to make before it'll be ready to share with you all, but it'll be something that will be like an 8.5 by 11 that you can print out and stick in your instructor notebook. So when people have questions about their specific app, if you want to troubleshoot, that's something you can do. And that's based on what we learned in the mapping webinar. We're going to essentially do the same thing with the beacon webinar. I hope that will be useful. I appreciate that all those folks were willing to come together in one place to answer instructor questions, because I know how busy you all are and I don't want to ask you to come to 5 different webinars. So hopefully we can get a lot of those questions answered, and then we'll have a similar cheat sheet resource. And then that one is free. The rest of these for our, I'm really excited about all of them. I think they're all going to be really valuable. Those are all paid. They're $15 each, or $40 for all 4. And those are, that small fee just covers so that we can pay people for their time, those presenters. You all know how to register because you managed to do it for this one. So avtraining.org/continuing education. And then if you don't mind, before you go, if you don't mind scanning this QR code, and then I'm also going to just drop the link in the chat. I'm going to try to drop the link in the chat. Because it's really useful to me to know how these webinars are going. There's a chance to ask questions and suggest other topics that would be useful to you. But please provide some feedback. Just take 2 seconds and let us know how this went for you so that we can continue to improve these. I really don't want CE to be like a hoop that you all have to jump through. I really want it to be something that's actually useful and worthy of your very limited free time. So take a second, let me know how we did. Thank you all so much for joining. I really appreciate it. I promise the rest of these webinars are not just going to be 90 minutes of me talking at you. That's my least favorite thing to do as an educator. I just could not think of a better way to get this information out in a really short time. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your great questions. I really appreciate it. I'm going to stay on the line for the next few minutes, just as folks are filtering out, just so that you can still see this QR code. And also, if you have other questions or want to raise your hand and chat, I will be here. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.
One thing I might recommend, Emma, is some providers I've worked with have developed their own online content. And, you know, I think I think seeing or feeling like there were some deficiencies in what AIARE was providing. And maybe trying to create more of a standalone replacement for, you know, a full 8 hours of classroom time.
Yeah.
So I guess one idea or suggestion might be just trying to get a sense of what content providers might be using on their own, or if there's sort of, I mean, people may not be willing to share, but feels like there's an opportunity to, you know, everybody's reinventing the same wheel in doing this, and it seems like there might be a potential for some sharing of content or best practices.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I'll make a note to ask some providers about that. I know we have a few that I know have some really good online learning whose ideas I would love to draw from. So that's a great suggestion.
Sure. And a lot of that depends on the LMS you're using, but you know, what it's capable of doing. But yeah, you know, just something to think about. I think interactivity is an area where there's a lot of room for improvement, but a lot depends on the system you're in.
Yeah. Yes, that has been one of my big frustrations. Lindsay, I think I just typed an answer. Do you have another question or?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, this was super helpful and thank you for doing it. And one, it would be nice if this was earlier. Like we've already figured out how we're doing our format for this year
Okay.
and everything and advertise to students. And so I think in the future, it could be valuable that either this is done in the spring or just, like August, because almost all of our courses are full.
Okay. That's really good feedback. Thank you, Lindsay. That's helpful to know.
Yeah, and I think one other thing like along those lines too is, and this is like kind of speaking a little bit to what Lauren was saying. So like one of my roles at Sawtooth Mountain Guides, besides being a, in the field avalanche instructor, is I personally check all of our students to see if they've done the online learning. And
Mhm.
that's been, so we call me like super course leader.
I think you are. I
Um,
think you are probably a super course leader in that sense. I don't think everyone's doing that.
Well, because just like you spoke to, like if we're asking them to do something and we've had a lot of success with students all showing up with like the same baseline then.
Totally.
Um, and obviously, but in some ways we created like a position for that. And again, I know that not everyone is doing, so I think sometimes, and it will be interesting, and I'd love to like get with you partway through the season because I'm definitely going to be the one like reading the answers to students' questions. Because I agree with you, I think it's important, but I do think it's starting to feel like we're having a lot of trouble, and this is why my role was created with leaders, just feeling like there's more and more added onto your plate
Mhm.
and more admin, and then that's what burns them out. And so that's why my role was created so that we can keep really great instructors in the field and help with some of the like help take off their plate some of the reasons why they don't want to be course leaders anymore.
Totally.
So
That
anyways, that's just some like general feedback. And I would also, sorry, just one more point and then
is.
I'm done. I just thought I should stay on while I had the opportunity to talk with you. Is I asked that beacon transceiver question.
Okay.
And I would say I have had several students and even just on guided days, people show up with inReaches and as beacons because to them the definition of beacon is something that just sends out a signal
Yeah.
and a transceiver sends and receives. And I've talked to a lot of search and rescue people about this, and they're trying to, they've been asking us, like, please use the word avalanche transceivers. I know we can't influence everything, but I do think as AIARE providers, if we could help educate people on why the word transceiver and that was somewhere in there, then it would actually like help overall safety because, in all of our pre-course literature, we still have people that like we encounter that show up with an inReach. I can only imagine people just that haven't taken a course going out thinking that they've done everything right
Totally.
and they have an inReach. So I would just say that's some like food for thought.
Yeah. No, that's really, thank you for that. That's really helpful to know. I think it is just um it's that balance of teaching people what's correct and also making sure people understand, like, because like you said, we can't influence everything. It's like, how do we make sure that people have the information they need for like what's really happening and also influence them to use correct terminology. So I think obviously
Yeah,
we
and
can
we've
do
just
better
been
at that.
telling people like the definition of like, look, you're going to see beacons out there, and we're trying to get more and more people to say avalanche transceiver. And
Yeah,
here's the like definitions. And, if you can encourage people to use transceiver. But yes, when you like do a Google search to look for a new transceiver, you are still going to have to sometimes put an avalanche beacon. And
totally.
that's just how it is. But so I don't know that's how at least we've been talking about it, just again as like some food for thought, because until a couple years ago, I would have been like, it doesn't matter. And then I have had several situations where I'm like, oh man, I I have a different lens now.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I mean, that's why I'm really glad to hear from practitioners too, that like, I really am these days, I really am just on the education side and I'm mostly behind a desk and I only get out to a couple courses a year. So it's really good to hear from you all, like what's actually happening out there. And that's really valuable. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And yeah, Emma, I'd love to like connect midwinter on some of those questions or if you ever need anything.
Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. I actually put in my notes a reminder to reach out to you because I want to hear what people are saying.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Hey, Billy.
Hi, Emma. Thanks so much. That was great. I was 94% there making a little dinner for my kiddos, so I apologize if this was
No.
covered. You said something about content changes. You didn't want to hit on content changes now. Are there significant content changes coming up, and or is the field book different this season?
No, it's a really good question. No significant content changes. That I was just saying that in reference to there were some questions. I think a lot of people have been having questions recently about there were a couple of presentations at ISSW that are sort of like, okay, we should be incorporating some of this new information into our curriculum, and some that were like, we may not, we may hold off on incorporating some of this information a little more. So that usually, like, we usually take about a season to catch up. It's too fast. So no significant content changes, just like the way content is conveyed. So really it's all just like language and tone, but we haven't made any big content changes for this season. So there won't be anything unfamiliar or that you all haven't seen before. Really, I think these questions, that one specifically was about the speed of reaching an airway in a rescue scenario when you're digging 1.5 times the burial depth away versus closer to the probe. There was a presentation at ISSW that I think had some people scratching their heads, and so a little bit of conversation about that, but nothing will change this year.
Yeah, I think that's good. Well, cool. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Billy.
Yeah, talk soon.
All right, folks. Yeah, feel free to shoot me an email, emma.walker@avtraining.org, or leave a note in the feedback. Thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate it, and it was great to see all of your names.